So we've discussed how John Goffman was the first to describe the diet, heart, and lipid hypotheses. So the next question is, well, how did Ansel Keys become recognized as the father of those two hypotheses? And that's the point we'll describe here under point number 3. So Ansel Keys stole the idea of the diet, heart, and lipid hypotheses from John Goffman, as it was his final chance for immortality. What you need to understand that in the 1950s, the US government had enacted a new law which invested a huge amount of money into heart disease research. And so there was going to be a scramble to see who could get the money. And the first person out of the blocks was obviously John Goffman, because he had all the qualifications to lead it. But Ansel Keys had no qualifications. He was a physiologist. He was not a cardiologist. He was not medically trained. And so he had to find some way to usurp the position of John Goffman. And I'll explain how he did that. So Ansel Keys stole this idea that what you eat raises your cholesterol. If you eat a high diet high in saturated fats, raises your cholesterol. That clogs your arteries, and then that causes the clinical manifestations of coronary heart disease. Now, instead of going through each of those steps in detail, he kind of did the shortcut. And so his link was point 4 on this graph. And he did studies in different countries, as I'll show, and I'll show you how he found those data, that countries which ate more saturated fat supposedly had higher rates of coronary heart disease. So initially, his whole basis for his hypothesis was he didn't go through stages 1, 2, 3, and 4. He just went through stage 4 and pretty much ignored the 1, 2, and 3. So he developed his models on the basis of association epidemiological observational population studies that suggested that link. And that was the basis for the model. And sadly, it became ingrained that the associational data were good enough and that we should therefore accept numbers 1, 2, and 3 on the basis of the relationship between diet and country rates of coronary heart disease. So here's the famous graph that he developed, and in which he had a relationship between the percent calories from fat and the CHD death rates in those countries. Now the question is, where did he find those data? And the answer is he was glancing through some information one day and he came across this WHO annual epidemiological and vital statistics document, which had these two graphs. On the left was the relationship between fat and heart and deaths, and on the right was calories from animal protein. And he then took out the 6 red dots, as you can see, and he excluded the relationship between calories from animal protein, which you can see appears to be a rather better relationship. So he collected his 6 countries, and that's where he got the data from the World Health Organization. So someone else went and looked at the consumption of visible animal fat in all the 22 countries, and he showed that there were 2 clusters, one with a low consumption of visible animal fat and another with high animal fat consumption. And Keys very cleverly selected 4 countries from the low visible animal fat consumption, and he chose the 2 countries with the highest visible animal fat consumptions, the 2 countries with the highest rates of heart disease, which also happened to have quite a high rate of saturated fat intake. So on the basis of all those 7 countries, he came up with his remarkably exponential graph. But you can see that had he chosen some of those countries, he might have found it a little more difficult to find that relationship. In 1955, these 2 workers, Jerushalmi and Hilliberg, wrote a paper which was the result of a conference at which Keys spoke, and these 2 professors spoke. And they were very critical because they said there were 26 or so countries that he could have chosen, 22 countries he could have chosen, but he selected those ones that fitted closest to the line. And they made the point that epidemiology doesn't explain causation. It can find reasons for disease, but it can't explain causation unless the relationship is very, very strong. So they said the evidence from 22 countries for which data are available indicates that the association between the percentage of fat calories available for consumption in the national diets and mortality from atherosclerotic and degenerative heart disease is not valid. The association is specific neither for dietary fat nor for heart disease mortality. And they showed that there were a number of other correlations which were rather stronger. So they concluded clearly this tenuous association cannot serve as much support for the hypothesis which implicates fat as an etiological factor in atherosclerotic and degenerative heart disease. The tragedy, as everyone knows, is this became the basis for the low-fat theory that eating a low-fat diet will prevent heart disease. And it was, as these scientists pointed out, it wasn't acceptable evidence. So to prove their point, in their paper, they took 6 countries and they showed an inverse relationship between the deaths from stroke and the consumption of fat calories. So that Japan, who had the highest rates of stroke, had the lowest rate of calorie fat from calorie consumption. What's really interesting is that in all these studies, Japan is always chosen to anchor the left side of the graph. And Japan's a very interesting country because it has high rates of stroke, but low rates of coronary heart disease. And we'll come back to that later. So the point that the scientists were making was that if you look at associational data, you can come up with any relationship you want. And they were trying to make the point that how can Japan, if cholesterol is a key issue and fat intake's a key issue, why does Japan have a high rate of stroke and a low rate of heart disease, whereas the United States has the opposite relationship? I was reading this book recently, and Alice Stewart is one of the world's famous epidemiologists who was never recognized properly, largely because she was a woman and she was working in Richard Dole's laboratory, and he didn't think much of her, and he was in competition with her. You remember that Richard Dole was the epidemiologist who found evidence that cigarette smoking causes cancer. Well, she found from her own studies that low-level radiation given to a fetus in the mother's womb causes an increased risk of leukemia in childhood. And it was a phenomenal finding, probably Nobel Prize-winning stuff, but she wasn't ever really acknowledged. And in the book, there's this paragraph. And so I say, epidemiology ain't so simple, Ansel. This only looks simple, but it's far from simple, and it amazes me, Alice Stewart, that people think they can just count a few things, make a few correlations, that they can just step into epidemiology from another subject, be a physicist or something, and then become an epidemiologist overnight. Epidemiology requires a great deal of skill and training. And that's the truth. And the truth is that Keyes did not have that training. He simply came across this World Health Organization document. He usurped it as his own, and that kicked off this whole story that cholesterol causes heart disease. So here we have the relationship, and I'm going to focus a little bit on Japan because Japan is such an interesting country. Japan has to anchor the left side of this graph. So what you would think, of course, is, well, Japan must be doing pretty well in heart disease rates. They're pretty low. There's nothing more they can do to make it lower. Well, it turns out they did do something, and they reduced their rates of heart disease lower. And what they did was the exact opposite to what Ansel Keys said they should do to lower their heart disease rates. And this is a fundamentally important finding because Keyes used Japan as a crucial part of his story. But yet, in the years since he drew this graph, heart disease rates have gone down in Japan as they've increased their fat consumption. So that in itself destroys his hypothesis. And I might add that on this graph, Italy has shown the same response. They have also increased their fat intake and their heart disease rates have gone down, as have Spain and Switzerland and a couple of other European countries. So here's the evidence, and what it shows is if we start at the bottom, we'll see that in 1946, Japanese had 12% of their energy in their daily energy intake was from protein, 7% from fat, and 81% from carbohydrates. And then if we look on the second curve, you'll see that the carbohydrate consumption has fallen, and that's registered on the bottom graph. You'll see that the calories from carbohydrates went from 80.6 to 59.2. And what's happened to replace the carbohydrates? Well, total energy has gone up slightly, but fat and protein from animals has gone up. So if we look here at the yellow curve in the third from bottom graph, you'll see that fat from animals has increased from the 1950s to the 1990s. Other fat sources have increased as well, but also protein from animals has increased substantially. So the fat consumption of the Japanese has gone from 7 to 25% during this period. Here's the data for carbohydrate intake, and you can see that total grains and rice have gone down, potatoes and wheat potatoes have gone down, wheat stayed pretty much the same. You'll see that some of the fruits have come up. Confectionery has increased initially and has dropped down again, and sugar has stayed pretty constant since the 1950s. But notice fish consumption has gone up, milk and dairy produce has gone up, meat has gone up, and eggs have gone up. Now these are exactly the foods that Ancel Keys says we should be avoiding to prevent heart disease. So this evidence here is good enough to disprove his hypothesis. Now what happened to cholesterol in Japanese during this period? That's the blue line at the bottom, and you can see in the men and in the women it's gone up substantially to become the same as other countries. These are 6 or 7 other countries in which cholesterol has been coming down since the 1980s. And despite this, heart disease rates have not gone up in Japan, they've come down, and so have the stroke rates, which is relatively remarkable. Now, because the Japanese are such an interesting population, a large number of studies have been done on Japanese living either in Japan, and that's called the Nippon component of this title, in Honolulu, Hawaii, or in San Francisco, California. So this is the Nihon-san study. And this was designed to show what happened when the Japanese went to live in Hawaii or California. And what you see is that for any risk factor, be it blood pressure in the left graphs, cholesterol levels in the middle graphs, or smoking on the right graphs, you'll see that the Japanese living in California are at much greater risk of heart attacks and development of coronary artery disease than are the Japanese who continue to live in Japan, with the Japanese living in Hawaii in the intermediate position. And this occurs across all the risk factors at any level of risk, which we can't explain, because this tells you that there's something in the environment which we aren't measuring, which is linking to their risk of heart disease. So this disproves the idea that risk factors carry all the evidence, i.e. blood pressure, cholesterol, and smoking carry all the evidence we need to know about a person's risk for heart disease. It's very clear that they don't. But what's even more interesting is that although heart disease rates may differ apart in these countries, depending on where the Japanese are living, total mortality is not different. So that's the remarkable point. Although the prevalence of all CHD events was strongly influenced by where the study participants were living, importantly, total mortality was the same in all 3 groups of ancestral Japanese, regardless of where they lived. So we really have to be very cautious when we think we know what's causing heart disease. As I showed in the very beginning of these lectures, we really don't know what causes heart disease, and risk factors aren't very helpful in telling us more because there's something that we're completely missing. Clearly, it's important to distinguish between the causa vera, the real cause, and the reasons for coronary heart disease. To re-emphasize, we do not know what causes coronary atherosclerosis and coronary heart disease. Now, here's another really interesting study by Thomas J. Tom. He looked at 26 countries and measured their trends in total mortality and mortality from heart disease in the years 1950 to 1978, when heart disease rates were initially going up, and then in the 60s they were beginning to fall in the United States. So he's looked at 26 countries, and he's also looked at men and women. And let's begin with the women, because that's easy. You'll see here are all the different countries at the top, the 26 countries. And each of these graphs is made up of 6 time periods. So what we see on the left is that the women in the United States, the heart disease rates have been falling dramatically since the 1950s. Whereas in the men, the fall was not quite as fast initially, but then it's become rather more rapid. Whereas if we look at other countries like Norway, you'll notice that in Norway, the heart disease rates in men were going down, and in women they were going up. And that's really interesting because the Norwegians are eating the same diet, whether they're men or women, and they're probably exposed to other similar environmental factors, yet the heart disease rates were different. So again, this is to confirm that we can't just take the United States as an example of what's happening across the world. We have to consider every country differently and separately. And Keyes really perhaps didn't do that because he was suggesting that there was one size fits every country. And what this shows is not only is it not one size fits all for each country, the men and the women are different. Again, confirming that epidemiology is misleading if we're going to think that we can take a singular example of one country and apply that evidence to all other countries.